Before the sword had a name, long before the word samurai carried weight before blades were named, and lineages shouted across fields, there was only land season and survival. Picture the first light of morning spreading across ancient Japan. Mist rises from flooded rice paddies, drifting low and silver over the earth. Frogs call from hidden banks. The air smells of wet soil and young grain. In the distance, forested hills stand dark and still as they have for centuries. This story begins here, before warriors ruled, before swords defined identity, before honor was spoken aloud. It begins with people learning how to protect what they had grown. In the earliest periods of Japanese history, society was shaped not by armies but by agriculture. During the Yayoi period, beginning around the 3rd century, BCE, wet rice farming spread across the islands, transforming daily life. Fields required cooperation. Irrigation demanded coordination. Harvests created surplus. And surplus created inequality. Where rice could be stored, wealth accumulated. Where wealth accumulated, disputes followed. Communities began to recognize the need for protection not only against nature, but against one another. Early weapons were practical tools, spears hardened in fire bows, made of wood and sinew iron blades imported or crudely forged. These were not symbols yet. They were necessities. Leadership emerged naturally from those who could organize defense and command trust. Over time, these leaders gathered followers, men who trained to fight, who learned the terrain, who stayed close to the land they defended. They were not soldiers of a state. They were protectors of place. By the Kofun period, from roughly the 3rd to 6th centuries, CE power became visible in the landscape itself. Massive burial mounds rose across the plains, some shaped like keyholes when viewed from above. These tombs belonged to local rulers' figures who commanded labor land and armed retainers. Inside, archaeologists have found armor weapons and mirrors. Not art alone. Authority made solid. The presence of armor in death suggests something important. Power had become inseparable from the ability to use force. At the same time, Japan was not isolated from the wider world. Across the sea, the civilizations of China and the Korean Peninsula exerted enormous influence. Writing systems, advanced metallurgy, horsemanship, and political ideas crossed water through diplomacy and migration. From China came Confucian principles, hierarchy, loyalty, duty. From the continent came improved ironworking and military technology. These ideas did not replace local traditions, they layered onto them. By the 7th century, the Yamato court sought to consolidate authority over the islands. Through reforms inspired by Chinese models, land was theoretically nationalized, taxes standardized, and conscription attempted. The emperor ruled by divine descent, linking political authority to sacred legitimacy. On paper, Japan became centralized. In practice, it did not. Geography resisted control. Mountain ranges divided regions. Roads were poor. Communication was slow. Officials appointed by the court often governed provinces they never visited, relying on reports and intermediaries. Local power remained local, and local power required protection. To manage distant lands, the court increasingly relied on provincial elites, wealthy families, temple estates, and clan leaders who maintained order on the ground. These groups hired armed retainers to defend boundaries, suppress banditry, and resolve disputes. These retainers lived among farmers, but stood apart from them. They trained with weapons. They answered to patrons, not to law alone. Quietly, a warrior class was forming. Conscription proved ineffective and was gradually abandoned. Peasant soldiers lacked training and motivation. Maintaining standing armies drained resources. The solution was simple, if unintended outsource violence. Armed professionals replaced citizen soldiers, and those professionals learned their value. By the late Nara and early Heian periods, these provincial fighters had become essential. While the capital refined ritual and aesthetics, the countryside dealt in realities. In Heian-kyo, modern Kyoto, aristocrats wrote poetry, debated calligraphy styles, and measured prestige through clothing and language. Physical hardship was avoided. Violence was considered polluting. Far from the capital, men rode horses through rain and mud. They guarded granaries. They settled conflicts with force. Two worlds coexisted uneasily. The court believed it ruled both. But only one world understood violence. Gradually, military families emerged whose identity was rooted in service and strength. Many traced their lineage to imperial ancestors, granting them legitimacy while living far from court life. These families would later become famous: the Taira, the Minamoto, and others. At first, they served the court, loyally suppressing rebellions, policing provinces, enforcing imperial will. But each campaign taught them something: how to command men, how to reward loyalty, how to survive betrayal. Experience became inheritance. Early warrior life was harsh and cyclical. Men farmed when not fighting. Armor was heavy and uncomfortable. Weapons were precious and maintained carefully. Training was constant, but informal, passed from father to son, leader to follower. There was no code yet, only expectation. Loyalty was repaid with protection. Betrayal ended reputations. Memory outlasted law. Combat in this era was personal. Warriors fought for recognition as much as victory. Names mattered. Lineage mattered. To be seen mattered. A man who fought bravely could rise. A man who fled would be remembered. Honor at this stage was practical rather than philosophical. Women, too, played crucial roles. They managed estates, secured alliances through marriage, and sometimes defended households during unrest. The warrior world was not isolated from family life. It was embedded in it. Power passed through bloodlines as much as blades. By the 10th century, the balance had begun to shift visibly. Provincial warriors accumulated land and influence. The court increasingly relied on them to maintain order. It could no longer enforce directly. The emperor still reigned, but authority was slipping outward. This was not yet the age of the samurai as rulers, but it was the age of preparation. The sword had not claimed symbolic power. The bow had not yet defined identity. The word samurai itself, meaning those who serve, had not fully taken shape. Yet the foundation was laid. As night falls over early Japan, torches flicker along rural paths. Somewhere a horse snorts softly in the dark. A man checks the edge of his blade not for glory, but for readiness. The world is quiet, but it will not remain so for long. Courtiers and shadows. The birth of the warrior. Class night settles gently over Heian-kyo. Lantern light glows through paper screens. Silk robes whisper as courtiers move through long corridors. Somewhere a poet pauses, listening to the wind brush the eaves. At the center of Japan, the world appears calm, ordered, and beautiful. But beyond the capital's reach, another Japan is taking shape quietly, patiently, in shadow. The Heian period, beginning in 794, is remembered as an age of refinement. The imperial court cultivated elegance with almost devotional focus. Poetry was not a pastime, but a measure of character. Clothing, handwriting, and sensitivity to seasonal change defined status more than strength or endurance. To be noble was to be delicate. To be powerful was to be graceful. Violence belonged elsewhere. The capital itself was designed to reflect this vision. Wide avenues followed strict geometry. Palaces faced carefully chosen directions. Ritual governed daily life. Even emotions were expected to follow aesthetic norms. Yet this beauty depended on distance. The farther one traveled from Heian-kyo, the thinner the court's control became. Japan's provinces were difficult to govern. Mountains divided regions, roads were slow, and messages traveled at the pace of horses. Court-appointed governors often remained in Kyoto, delegating authority to local families who understood the land. These local elites managed estates, collected taxes, and resolved disputes. And when disputes turned violent, they needed men who could fight. Private estates Shun expanded rapidly during the Heian period. Many were exempt from imperial taxation, protected by legal privileges granted to nobles' temples or shrines. On paper, these lands were secure. In reality, they were vulnerable. Borders were unclear, records conflicted, rivals contested ownership. Force became the final argument. To defend these estates, armed retainers were hired and maintained year-round. These men, trained with weapons, patrolled boundaries and enforced their lord's claims. Over time, service became hereditary. Sons followed fathers. Loyalty became personal. These retainers were not courtiers. They lived closer to mud than to poetry. The imperial government attempted to maintain order through law, but enforcement depended on cooperation from the very men whose power it sought to limit. As a result, authority blurred. Justice became negotiated. Punishment became selective. Protection became a commodity. The court still issued decrees, but the provinces listened to swords. By the 9th and 10th centuries, this arrangement had created a distinct class of people. They were not peasants, yet not fully aristocratic. They were defined by service, by arms, and by obligation. They were called saburao, those who serve. From this word, samurai would eventually emerge. Among these families, two lineages grew especially prominent, the Taira and the Minamoto. Both traced their ancestry to emperors, granting them legitimacy while freeing them from direct court life. Sent to the provinces, they learned to command men and manage land. They became indispensable, and indispensable figures are difficult to control. While these warrior families grew stronger, the court grew increasingly inward. Aristocrats competed in poetry contests, documented romantic failures in diaries, and refined their emotional expression to exquisite detail. Physical hardship was avoided, martial skill was unnecessary, conflict was handled by others. The gap widened, yet the court did not ignore warriors entirely. When rebellions broke out, often led by disgruntled provincial leaders, it was military families who were summoned to suppress them. Each time they succeeded, their influence expanded. Victory brought reward, reward brought loyalty, loyalty brought power. The relationship was mutually reinforcing and increasingly unstable. Warriors learned that the court depended on them. The court learned that it could not rule without them. Neither fully acknowledged the truth. As warrior families accumulated land and followers, their internal culture developed. Reputation became central. Deeds were remembered and retold. Loyalty was praised not in abstract terms, but through concrete action. A man who stood firm earned trust. A man who faltered lost everything. Honor, still informal, began to harden into expectation. Women within warrior families played essential roles. They managed households during campaigns, arranged marriages to secure alliances, and ensured continuity of land and loyalty. Some were trained to defend estates in times of crisis. The warrior household was a unit of survival. By the mid-12th century, tensions that had once remained in the provinces began to spill into the capital itself. Court factions embroiled in succession disputes invited warrior clans to support their claims. This was a dangerous invitation. Armed men entered the world of poetry and ritual, and they did not leave unchanged. The Hogan disturbance of 1156 marked a turning point. A conflict over imperial succession escalated into open fighting in Kyoto. For the first time in generations, warriors clashed in the capital streets. Temples burned. Palaces were abandoned. The illusion of safety shattered. The warriors decided the outcome. Just 4 years later, the Heiji Rebellion followed. Again, court politics turned violent. Again, military families determined the result. This time, the Taira clan emerged dominant, led by Taira no Kiyomori, a man equally skilled in battle and court intrigue. He rose to the highest offices of state. He married into the imperial family. He ruled from within the court itself. The balance had tipped. To many, Kiyomori represented the future warriors openly exercising political power. To others, he embodied corruption force, wearing aristocratic robes. Either way, the precedent was set. Samurai were no longer merely servants. They were contenders. The Minamoto clan defeated in these struggles was scattered. Some were executed, others exiled. But memory endured. Resentment slept, not died. History in Japan moves slowly until it doesn't. As the Heian period drew toward its close, the old world still shimmered with beauty. Poetry was written, ceremonies continued. The emperor remained sacred, but beneath the surface authority had shifted. Power now lived in the countryside. It traveled on horseback. It answered to loyalty, not etiquette. As dawn breaks over Heian-kyo, a courtier composes a poem about falling blossoms. Beyond the city, a warrior tightens his armor straps, preparing for a journey that may not end peacefully. Two Japans awaken. Only one will endure. When the bow ruled the battlefield, morning fog settles low over an open plain. Grass bends beneath the weight of dew. Horses shift and breathe their hides warm in the cold air. Leather creaks softly as armor is adjusted, straps pulled tight with practiced hands. Before the sword became the soul of the samurai, it was the bow that defined him. In the late Heian period, warfare in Japan followed a rhythm shaped by land and season. Campaigns were not endless. They rose and fell with the agricultural calendar. Fields had to be planted. Harvests could not be missed. A warrior who abandoned his land entirely risked losing it. War existed alongside daily life, not apart from it. It arrived disrupted and withdrew only to return again. The ideal warrior of this age was a mounted archer. Horse and rider were trained as a single unit, moving together across uneven ground. Balance mattered as much as strength. A steady hand mattered more than speed. To draw a bow while riding required calm. To aim required patience. To release required certainty. Hesitation was dangerous. Rushing was worse. Bows were long and asymmetrical, designed to be used from horseback. Arrows were carefully crafted, fletched with feathers chosen for balance and sound. The whistle of an arrow in flight was familiar, a warning and a promise at once. Swords existed, but they were secondary. They were carried for close combat emergencies or ritual purposes. At this stage, the sword was not yet sacred. It was practical. Battles often began with formality. Warriors announced their names, ancestry, and achievements, calling out to opponents across the field. This was not mere boasting, it established identity. To defeat a renowned warrior brought honor. To defeat an unknown man brought little. Recognition mattered more than numbers. Combat itself was fluid and fragmented. Rather than rigid formations, fighting broke into clusters of individual encounters. Arrows flew, horses charged and retreated, men sought worthy opponents while avoiding chaos. It was loud, confusing, exhausting, and deeply personal. Armor of the period reflected these realities. Lamellar plates were laced together to allow movement. Helmets flared outward, both to deflect blows and to display identity. Bright cords and banners marked allegiance-making warriors visible across the field. War was meant to be seen, to be remembered. Yet beneath ceremony lay brutality. Villages were burned to deny resources. Fields were trampled. Civilians fled quietly into forests and hills. The warrior's honor did not shield others from suffering. This truth lingered often unspoken. As conflicts increased, warriors began to develop shared expectations of behavior. Loyalty to one's lord became central, not as an abstract virtue, but as a survival strategy. A man abandoned by his followers was powerless. A follower abandoned by his lord was ruined. Trust was currency. Once spent, it was rarely regained. Victory brought tangible rewards, land rights, tax privileges and status. Defeat brought loss, exile, or death. Memory carried consequences across generations. A family known for betrayal struggled to attract allies. A family known for loyalty gained followers. Reputation hardened into legacy. There was no single authority governing warfare. The imperial court issued edicts, but enforcement depended on the very warriors it sought to regulate. As a result, justice was uneven. Disputes were settled through negotiation or violence. The line between law and war blurred. Training was constant but informal. Skills were passed through observation and repetition. Fathers taught sons, leaders trained retainers. Experience mattered more than theory. There were no manuals yet, only practice. Women remained central to this system. They managed estates during campaigns, ensured continuity of land holding, and sometimes defended households during raids. Their role in maintaining stability was essential, though often unrecorded. The warrior world relied on them quietly. As decades passed, the scale of conflict grew. Warrior families expanded their networks. Small skirmishes escalated into regional wars. The Taira and Minamoto clans emerged as dominant forces, their rivalry spanning provinces. Each victory deepened tension. Each defeat sharpened resolve. The Bao remained supreme, but something was changing. Warriors began to fight not only for land, but for political influence. Campaigns increasingly intersected with court politics. Succession disputes and factional struggles in Kyoto drew armed men closer to the capital. The battlefield edged toward the palace. The rituals of warfare began to strain under pressure. When numbers grew, personal announcements became impractical. When stakes rose, efficiency mattered more than ceremony. The old style could not last forever. Yet even as warfare evolved, the values formed in this era endured. Courage under pressure, loyalty to one's lord, the acceptance of death as a possibility rather than a failure. These ideas would outlive the bow itself. As evening settles over a field now quiet, arrows lie scattered in trampled grass. Horses are led away. The wounded are tended. Survivors count names and losses. A warrior cleans his bowstring carefully. Another sharpens a blade he barely used. Tomorrow they return to their land. But history is gathering speed. The era of ritualized combat is nearing its end. The age of decisive war approaches, and when it arrives, it will change Japan forever. Part 4. The Genpei War, when warriors took the state. The sea moves restlessly beneath a gray sky. Waves strike the shore in slow, uneven rhythms. Salt hangs in the air. Far-off banners ripple against the wind, their colors blurred by mist. Japan is no longer drifting toward war. It has arrived. By the late 12th century, the delicate balance between court and warrior had finally broken. For generations, military families had served imperial authority while quietly accumulating power. Now that power demanded recognition. At the center of the tension stood two great houses, the Taira and the Minamoto. Their rivalry would decide the fate of the country. The Taira clan, led by Taira no Kiyomori, had risen higher than any warrior family before them. Kiyomori was not merely a general, he was a statesman. He navigated court politics with precision, securing appointments, arranging marriages, and embedding his family within the imperial line itself. At his peak, his grandson sat on the throne. For the first time, a warrior ruled Japan from inside the court. Yet this dominance bred unease. Aristocrats resented their displacement. Provincial warriors felt excluded from reward. The Minamoto clan, long rivals of the Taira, watched from exile and obscurity. Peace existed, but it was brittle. In 1180, that peace shattered. A call to arms circulated in the name of Prince Mochihito, a disaffected imperial figure who opposed Taira influence. The message traveled quickly through the provinces, carried by messengers, and whispered at gatherings of warriors. To many, it sounded like opportunity. The Genpei War had begun. At first, the conflict was disorganized. Alliances shifted. Some warriors hesitated, unsure which side would prevail. Battles erupted in river valleys, mountain passes, and along narrow roads. War was slow and uncertain. Food shortages weakened armies. Disease followed camps. Messages arrived too late. Victory depended as much on patience as on force. From this uncertainty emerged Minamoto no Yoritomo. Exiled since youth, Yoritomo had learned restraint. Rather than rushing toward the capital, he focused on consolidating power in eastern Japan. He secured land, forged alliances, and built a stable base of support. He understood something others did not. Power was not seized in a single moment. It was constructed. Meanwhile, the capital suffered. Kyoto, once insulated from violence, became a place of fear. Factions clashed openly, temples burned, noble families fled. The refined world of poetry and ceremony found itself unable to contain the consequences of inviting warriors into its disputes. The city trembled, and the old order cracked. As the war progressed, the Minamoto gained strength. Key victories shifted momentum. Experienced commanders emerged. Coordination improved. The Taira, once dominant, began to retreat westward toward their coastal strongholds. The conflict narrowed and intensified. The final phase of the Genpei War unfolded at sea. Naval engagements became decisive as the Taira relied on maritime routes for supply and retreat. Ships crowded narrow straits. Archers fired from unstable decks. Currents pulled vessels out of formation. The sea itself became a weapon. In 1185, the war reached its climax at the Battle of Dan-no-ura. The strait was choked with ships. Tides shifted unpredictably. Arrows darkened the sky. Amid chaos, alliances broke. Some commanders defected. Others misjudged the currents. One by one, Taira vessels were overwhelmed. As defeat became inevitable, members of the Taira leadership chose death over capture, leaping into the sea with imperial regalia in their arms. The water closed over them. The war ended. The Minamoto had triumphed, but victory raised questions no warrior had yet answered. Who would govern Japan now, and how Minamoto no Yoritomo did not return power to the court. Instead, he built something new. From his base in Kamakura, far from Kyoto's intrigues, he established a military government, the Shogunate. The emperor remained as a sacred figure, but authority now rested with the shogun and his warrior administration. It was a quiet revolution, and it endured. This shift marked a turning point in Japanese history. Warriors were no longer instruments of rule. They were the rulers. Their values, loyalty, service, pragmatic justice, would now shape law, land holding, and society itself. The age of courtly dominance had ended, yet the cost was immense. The Genpei War left fields, ruined families destroyed, and trust fractured. Victory did not bring immediate peace. It brought adjustment and uncertainty. The samurai had claimed the state. Now they had to learn how to hold it. As night falls over the strait of Dan-no-ura, the sea returns to its endless motion. Debris drifts silently. The cries of battle fade into memory. On land, a new order settles, in still fragile, still forming. Japan has changed, and it will never return to what it was before. The Genpei War, when warriors took the state. The sea moves restlessly beneath a gray sky. Waves strike the shore in slow, uneven rhythms. Salt hangs in the air. Far-off banners ripple against the wind, their colors blurred by mist. Japan is no longer drifting toward war. It has arrived. By the late 12th century, the delicate balance between court and warrior had finally broken. For generations, military families had served imperial authority while quietly accumulating power. Now that power demanded recognition. At the center of the tension stood two great houses, the Taira and the Minamoto. Their rivalry would decide the fate of the country. The Taira clan, led by Taira no Kiyomori, had risen higher than any warrior family before them. Kiyomori was not merely a general, he was a statesman. He navigated court politics with precision, securing appointments, arranging marriages, and embedding his family within the imperial line itself. At his peak, his grandson sat on the throne. For the first time, a warrior ruled Japan from inside the court. Yet this dominance bred unease. Aristocrats resented their displacement. Provincial warriors felt excluded from reward. The Minamoto clan, long rivals of the Taira, watched from exile and obscurity. Peace existed, but it was brittle. In 1180, that peace shattered. A call to arms circulated in the name of Prince Mochihito, a disaffected imperial figure who opposed Taira influence. The message traveled quickly through the provinces, carried by messengers, and whispered at gatherings of warriors. To many, it sounded like opportunity. The Genpei War had begun. At first, the conflict was disorganized. Alliances shifted. Some warriors hesitated, unsure which side would prevail. Battles erupted in river valleys, mountain passes, and along narrow roads. War was slow and uncertain. Food shortages weakened armies. Disease followed camps. Messages arrived too late. Victory depended as much on patience as on force. From this uncertainty emerged Minamoto no Yoritomo. Exiled since youth, Yoritomo had learned restraint. Rather than rushing toward the capital, he focused on consolidating power in eastern Japan. He secured land-forged alliances and built a stable base of support. He understood something others did not. Power was not seized in a single moment. It was constructed. Meanwhile, the capital suffered. Kyoto, once insulated from violence, became a place of fear. Factions clashed openly. Temples burned. Noble families fled. The refined world of poetry and ceremony found itself unable to contain the consequences of inviting warriors into its disputes. The city trembled, and the old order cracked. As the war progressed, the Minamoto gained strength. Key victories shifted momentum. Experienced commanders emerged, coordination improved. The Taira, once dominant, began to retreat westward toward their coastal strongholds. The conflict narrowed and intensified. The final phase of the Genpei War unfolded at sea. Naval engagements became decisive as the Taira relied on maritime routes for supply and retreat. Ships crowded narrow straits. Archers fired from unstable decks. Currents pulled vessels out of formation. The sea itself became a weapon. In 1185, the war reached its climax at the Battle of Dan-no-ura. The strait was choked with ships. Tides shifted unpredictably. Arrows darkened the sky. Amid chaos, alliances broke. Some commanders defected. Others misjudged the currents. One by one, Taira vessels were overwhelmed. As defeat became inevitable, members of the Taira leadership chose death over capture, leaping into the sea with imperial regalia in their arms. The water closed over them. The war ended. The Minamoto had triumphed, but victory raised questions no warrior had yet answered. Who would govern Japan now, and how Minamoto no Yoritomo did not return power to the court. Instead, he built something new. From his base in Kamakura, far from Kyoto's intrigues, he established a military government, the Shogunate. The emperor remained as a sacred figure, but authority now rested with the shogun and his warrior administration. It was a quiet revolution, and it endured. This shift marked a turning point in Japanese history. Warriors were no longer instruments of rule. They were the rulers. Their values, loyalty, service, pragmatic justice, would now shape law land holding and society itself. The age of courtly dominance had ended, yet the cost was immense. The Genpei War left fields, ruined families destroyed, and trust fractured. Victory did not bring immediate peace. It brought adjustment and uncertainty. The samurai had claimed the state. Now they had to learn how to hold it. As night falls over the Strait of Dan-no-ura, the sea returns to its endless motion. Debris drifts silently. The cries of battle fade into memory. On land, a new order settles in still fragile, still forming. Japan has changed, and it will never return to what it was before. The first shogunate power moves, east morning, come slowly to Kamakura. The sound of waves reaches inland, steady and patient. Pine trees stir in the coastal wind. Mist lifts from narrow valleys, revealing wooden buildings clustered beneath low hills. This is not Kyoto. There are no grand avenues, no ritual gates aligned to the stars. This is a place chosen for strength, not beauty. And from here Japan will be ruled. When Minamoto no Yoritomo emerged victorious from the Genpei War, he faced a problem unlike any before him. The old order had collapsed, but it still existed in memory, custom, and ritual. The emperor remained sacred. The court still claimed legitimacy. Yoritomo did not seek to destroy these traditions. He sought to stand above them. Rather than govern from Kyoto, Yoritomo established his base in Kamakura far to the east. The choice was practical and symbolic. Kamakura was defensible, surrounded by hills, and open to the sea. More importantly, it lay among lands loyal to the Minamoto. Here the warrior ruled among warriors. Distance became power. In 1192, Yoritomo received the title Sei Taishogun, Great General, for the subjugation of the barbarians. The title itself was ancient, once granted temporarily during military campaigns. Under Yoritomo, it became permanent. For the first time, Japan had a standing military government. The emperor remained. The court continued its ceremonies, but authority had shifted east. The Kamakura shogunate did not abolish the old system. It overlaid it. Two centers of power now existed simultaneously, each dependent on the other in different ways. The court provided legitimacy and tradition. The shogunate provided enforcement and order. Between them stood the samurai. To govern the provinces, Yoritomo appointed trusted warriors as Shugo military governors and Jito estate stewards. These men were responsible for maintaining order, collecting taxes, and overseeing land. Their authority was grounded in service and loyalty. Their power was personal, not abstract. This system reflected the realities of the warrior world. Yet administering peace proved more complex than winning war. Land disputes multiplied as warriors sought to secure rewards promised during the conflict. Estates overlapped, records conflicted, appeals flooded the new government. Justice became a daily task. And justice in this era was practical rather than ideal. Yoritomo understood that loyalty depended on fairness. He established legal councils staffed by warriors who judged disputes based on precedent and service rather than aristocratic privilege. The law began to reflect warrior values. Clarity mattered, consistency mattered, results mattered. But stability rested on more than law. It rested on control. Yoritomo carefully limited the power of potential rivals even within his own family. Loyalty was rewarded, but ambition was watched closely. Trust existed, but it was never blind. Experience had taught him caution. After Yoritomo's death in 1199, the system he built faced immediate strain. His heirs lacked his authority. Factions emerged within the shogunate and power gradually shifted to the Hojo clan relatives of Yoritomo's wife. They ruled as regents, shikin governing in the name of the shogun. Once again, power moved quietly behind the scenes. The rise of the Hojo revealed something essential. The shogunate was no longer dependent on a single leader. It had become an institution. This transformation allowed it to endure, but it also introduced rigidity. Under Hojo leadership, the Kamakura government strengthened its legal framework. In 1232, the Goseibai Shikimoku, a warrior law code, was issued. It focused on land disputes, inheritance, and obligations between lords and retainers. It avoided abstract philosophy. It emphasized precedent. It spoke the language of experience. For the samurai, this law felt familiar. Daily life under the shogunate settled into a rhythm. Many warriors lived on or near their estates, balancing administrative duties with military readiness. Training continued, but war was no longer constant. There were seasons of quiet marked by farming repairs and family life. The warrior class became rooted. Religion continued to shape identity. Zen Buddhism spread further among samurai, offering discipline and acceptance of impermanence. Meditation complemented martial training, reinforcing calm and focus. Faith became internal rather than ceremonial. A strength carried quietly. Yet beneath stability, tension grew. The shogunate relied on loyalty, but loyalty required reward. Land was finite. Promises made during war were difficult to honor in peace. Younger warriors inherited obligations without opportunities. Frustration accumulated slowly. The Kamakura shogunate had created order, but it had also created expectations it could not always fulfill. Its strength lay in pragmatism. Its weakness lay in scarcity. The system worked until it was tested from outside. Beyond Japan's shores, an empire is rising, vast, disciplined, and unconcerned with tradition. Word reached Kamakura of Mongol conquests across Asia. At first, the threat felt distant. Then it did not. As evening settles over Kamakura, temple bells echo through pine-covered hills. Guards walk the paths, listening to the sea. Torches flicker against wooden walls. Japan is at peace, but history is gathering again beyond the horizon. Faith, discipline, and the inner sword. Before dawn, the temple is already awake. A wooden bell is struck, once then again its sound low and resonant. Mist drifts between cedar trunks. Incense burns in thin, patient lines that seem to hover rather than rise. A samurai kneels on the cold floor spine, straight hands resting lightly on his knees. His eyes are half closed. His breath is slow. This is not preparation for battle. This is preparation for himself. The Kamakura period was not only an age of political restructuring, it was a time of inward turning for the warrior class. After generations shaped by conflict, many samurai found themselves confronting a new reality, peace uncertainty, and the constant awareness of death without the constant presence of war. The question quietly spread among them. How should a warrior live when violence is no longer daily, but death remains possible? Buddhism had been present in Japan for centuries, supported and shaped by the imperial court. Its great temples emphasized ritual, scholarship, and ceremony. For warriors, however, this form of faith often felt distant from their lived experience. They did not seek ornament, they sought clarity. Zen Buddhism arrived from China in the late 12th and early 13th centuries, carried by monks who emphasized direct experience over doctrine. Zen taught that truth could not be fully explained, it had to be practiced. Sitting, breathing, observing. For men trained to act decisively under pressure, this approach resonated. Zen meditation stripped away distraction. It asked the practitioner to confront impermanence directly, to sit with discomfort, boredom, and fear without turning away. In this stillness, the samurai found a mirror. Fear of death dulled the mind. Attachment clouded judgment. Calm sharpened perception. These were not metaphors, they were survival lessons. Over time, Zen monasteries became centers not only of spiritual practice, but of education and discipline. Samurai studied meditation alongside calligraphy and ethics. Silence became as valuable as instruction. The ability to remain composed, to act without emotional turbulence, became a form of strength. The inner sword was being forged. Zen was not the only influence shaping samurai identity. Confucian ideas, long absorbed from Chinese thought, emphasized hierarchy, loyalty, and moral responsibility. These principles reinforced the bond between lord and retainer. To serve faithfully was not merely practical, it was virtuous. This moral framing gave structure to obedience and meaning to sacrifice. Shinto traditions also remained deeply rooted. Samurai honored local deities and ancestral spirits, believing that the land itself was alive with presence. Before campaigns, prayers were offered not only for victory, but for protection and return. Ritual purity mattered, balance mattered. The warrior walked between worlds spiritual and material without fully belonging to either. Together, these influences created a distinctive worldview, not yet a formal philosophy, and certainly not a single code, but a shared orientation toward life and death. This was the soil from which later ideas of Bushido would grow. But during the Kamakura period, these values were lived, not written. Daily life reflected this balance of discipline and duty. A samurai might begin his day with meditation or prayer, followed by administrative work, resolving disputes, managing land, overseeing labor. Training continued quietly without display. Weapons were maintained with care. Armor was stored, not worn. Restraint became a virtue. Art also found a place in this world. Samurai patronized calligraphy, poetry, and ink painting forms that valued simplicity and suggestion over excess. A single brushstroke could express more than elaborate decoration. This aesthetic mirrored Zen thought. What was left unsaid mattered most. Even swordsmanship began to change. Rather than constant combat, practice focused on form, timing, and awareness. The act of drawing a blade became deliberate, measured. Killing was no longer the goal. Control was. Yet faith did not erase hardship. The Kamakura Shogunate struggled to balance loyalty and reward. Younger warriors inherited obligations without land. Disputes multiplied. Tension simmered beneath outward calm. Spiritual discipline offered grounding, but it could not solve systemic problems. Beyond Japan's shores, the world was shifting. Reports arrived of a vast empire spreading across Asia. The Mongols unified under powerful leadership, conquering territory at unprecedented speed. At first, the threat felt abstract, a rumor carried by monks and traders. Then came letters. In 1268, envoys from Kublai Khan delivered demands to the Japanese court requesting submission. The language was formal, the implication unmistakable. For the samurai, this was something new, an enemy without lineage, a challenge without ritual, a war that might come by sea. Meditation could steady the mind, but it could not stop a fleet. As the temple bell sounds again in the growing light, the kneeling samurai opens his eyes. He rises slowly, bows once, and steps back into the world of duty. His faith has given him calm. Soon it will be tested. The Mongol storm. The wind reaches the shore before the ships do. It carries the smell of salt and distant rain, colder than expected for the season. Fishermen along the coast of northern Kyushu pause in their work, scanning the horizon, where sea and sky blend into a pale, uneasy line. The water looks the same as it always has, but something is coming. In the late 13th century, Japan faced a challenge unlike any it had known. For generations, war had meant familiar names, inherited rivalries, and rituals shaped by custom. Now the threat came from beyond the sea, impersonal, immense, and unconcerned with Japanese tradition. The Mongol Empire, under the leadership of Kublai Khan, had conquered vast territories across Asia. China had fallen. Korea had been compelled to submit. Japan, distant but visible, stood alone beyond the waves. And the Mongols noticed. The first contact came not with arrows, but with words. In 1268, envoys arrived bearing a message from Kublai Khan. It was written in the language of diplomacy, calm and formal, requesting that Japan recognize Mongol authority and enter a tributary relationship. The meaning beneath the courtesy was unmistakable: submit or face force. The imperial court and the Kamakura Shogunate debated in silence. There was no clear precedent for such a demand. Japan had absorbed culture and ideas from the continent for centuries, but military submission was another matter entirely. No reply was sent. Preparations began quietly. The shogunate ordered warriors in Kyushu to remain alert. Coastal defenses were reviewed. Messengers rode through provinces calling samurai to readiness. Yet even as they prepared, uncertainty lingered. What did it mean to fight an enemy who did not share your customs? How did one face warriors who did not announce their names? The samurai had no answers yet. In the autumn of 1274, the answer arrived by sea. A fleet of Mongol-led forces composed of Mongols, Koreans, and Chinese soldiers crossed the waters and landed along the coast of Kyushu. Their ships filled the bays. Their soldiers disembarked in disciplined formations. The first clashes were shocking. The Mongols did not fight as individuals seeking recognition. They fought as coordinated units. Shields overlapped, orders were shouted, arrows were released in massed volleys, explosive weapons, primitive bombs filled with gunpowder were hurled into Japanese ranks, bursting with thunder and smoke. Horses reared. Warriors stumbled disoriented by sound and fire. This was not the warfare Japan knew. The samurai adapted as best they could. Courage was not lacking. Small groups charged into unfamiliar formations. Arrows found targets. Blades met armor at close range. But the rhythm was wrong. The old rituals failed under pressure. After days of fighting, the Mongol forces withdrew to their ships. Whether they intended to regroup, await reinforcements, or simply reassess remains debated by historians. Then the weather turned. A storm rose suddenly, violent and unforgiving. Waves smashed against hulls, anchors dragged, ships collided and broke apart. The sea claimed men and supplies alike. The invasion faltered and the fleet retreated. Japan had survived. But survival brought no relief, only expectation. Everyone knew the Mongols would return. In the years that followed, the Shogunate prepared in earnest. Stone walls were constructed along vulnerable coastlines, especially around Hakata Bay. Patrols increased, garrisons were strengthened. Samurai were ordered to remain ready for years at a time. This constant vigilance came at a cost. Warriors left their lands unattended, crops suffered, debts grew, and still no rewards arrived. The fundamental problem remained unsolved. In internal wars, victory meant land seized from defeated rivals. Against foreign invaders, there were no estates to redistribute, no spoils to grant. How does a government reward those who defend the nation itself? The Kamakura Shogunate had no good answer. In 1281, the second invasion came. This time it was far larger. Two fleets advanced, one from Korea, another from southern China, intended to converge on Kyushu. Thousands of ships carried tens of thousands of soldiers. From the shore, it must have seemed as though the sea itself had turned to wood and sailcloth. The scale was overwhelming. Fighting was fierce and prolonged. The new coastal walls prevented easy landings. Samurai launched night raids from small boats, boarding enemy ships under cover of darkness, killing quickly, cutting rigging, and retreating before dawn. Day after day, the struggle continued. Heat, rain, exhaustion, war became attrition. The Mongol forces, unused to prolonged naval stalemate and plagued by supply difficulties, struggled to coordinate. Disease spread through crowded ships. Morale weakened. Still, the threat remained immense. And then once again, the weather changed. A massive typhoon struck the invasion fleet. Winds howled. Waves rose like walls. Ships smashed into one another or were driven onto rocks. Men were thrown into the sea armor, dragging them under. By the time the storm passed, the invasion was broken. Thousands were dead. The survivors fled. Later generations would call this storm kamikaze, the divine wind. To many at the time it felt like unmistakable protection from the gods. Shrines offered thanks. Stories spread quickly. Historians today speak more cautiously, noting geography, seasonal weather patterns, and Mongol logistical challenges. But for those who lived through it, explanation mattered less than survival. Japan had endured. Yet victory brought deepening strain. The shogunate remained mobilized for years afterward, expecting another invasion that never came. Samurai waited restless and unpaid. Disputes increased. Faith in leadership eroded. The government that had defended the country now struggled to defend itself. The Mongol invasions changed the samurai forever. They learned to fight differently. They learned the limits of tradition. They learned that the world beyond Japan could not be ignored. But perhaps most importantly, they learned that loyalty without reward could fracture even the strongest system. As the sea calms again along Kyushu's shores, broken planks wash onto the sand. Rusted arrowheads glint briefly in the sun before being buried by waves. The storm has passed, but the damage remains not only to ships and bodies, but to the balance of power itself. Fractured authority and the fall of Kamakura. The sea has grown quiet again. Fishing boats return to familiar routes. Nets are mended on shore. Smoke rises from village hearths as if nothing has changed. To the eye, life resumes its old rhythm. But beneath the surface, the world the samurai knew is beginning to crack. The Mongol invasions had tested the Kamakura shogunate in ways no internal conflict ever had. The government had fulfilled its most fundamental duty, defending the land from foreign conquest. Yet in doing so, it revealed a fatal weakness. Victory brought no reward. There were no conquered estates to distribute, no defeated rivals whose lands could be reassigned. Only years of service expense and sacrifice, followed by silence. For many warriors, this silence cut deeper than any blade. Samurai returned to their provinces burdened by debt. Fields had been neglected. Families had endured long absences. Armor was worn thin. Weapons needed repair. And yet stipends remained unchanged. Gratitude was offered. Titles were confirmed. But land, the foundation of loyalty, was scarce. Resentment settled slowly like dust. The Hojo regents who ruled the shogunate behind the figurehead shogun attempted to maintain stability through law. Courts heard an increasing number of petitions. Disputes over inheritance and land multiplied as families struggled to secure dwindling resources. Judgments were issued carefully, but fairness could not create prosperity. The system strained under pressures it could not resolve. Meanwhile, the imperial court in Kyoto watched. For decades, emperors had accepted a ceremonial role, their authority preserved in ritual but absent in reality. Yet the idea of direct imperial rule had never fully disappeared. Among the court emerged an emperor unwilling to accept this arrangement. His name was Go-Daigo. Emperor Go-Daigo was determined, ambitious, and deeply committed to restoring imperial authority. Unlike his predecessors, he did not seek compromise with the warrior government. He sought its removal. Quietly at first, he built alliances among disaffected nobles and warriors. He promised reform reward and a return to a more ancient vision of Rule One, guided by the emperor rather than by military regents. For frustrated samurai, this vision was tempting. Change often looks brightest to those who feel forgotten. The first attempts at rebellion failed. Go-Daigo was captured by Kamakura forces and exiled. The shogunate appeared secure once more. Order seemed restored. But authority weakened not through sudden collapse, but through erosion. Trust had been damaged, and damaged trust spreads invisibly. Within the shogunate itself, loyalty was no longer absolute. Many warriors obeyed out of habit rather than conviction. Some questioned whether Kamakura still served their interests. Among them was a respected general, Ashikaga Takauji. Takauji came from a powerful military family with deep roots in eastern Japan. He had served the Kamakura government, faithfully commanding troops and enforcing its authority. When Go-Daigo's rebellion resumed, Takauji was dispatched to suppress it. Instead, he made a choice that altered history. He turned against Kamakura. Historians debate his motives. Some argue ambition drove him. Others point to dissatisfaction with Hojo rule. Still others suggest genuine belief in imperial restoration. The truth likely lies between these explanations. Motives like loyalties are rarely pure. Takauji's defection shattered the fragile balance. Warriors across Japan were forced to choose sides. Old alliances dissolved. Former comrades met as enemies. Provinces erupted into conflict as the struggle between shogunate and court spread outward. The samurai world fractured. Once again, Japan entered civil war. In 1333, the decisive moment came. Imperial forces, aided by defecting generals, marched on Kamakura itself. The city that had once symbolized warrior authority now found itself surrounded. Defenses failed. Escape routes closed. Facing inevitable defeat, the Hojo leadership made a final decision. They chose death. In a grim act that echoed warrior values taken to their extreme, members of the Hojo clan committed mass suicide rather than submit to capture. Kamakura burned. Its temples and halls collapsed into ash. The first shogunate ended not with negotiation, but with annihilation. The age it represented was over. For a brief moment, Go-Daigo's dream seemed realized. The emperor returned to power. Imperial authority was restored. The court resumed control over governance. This period became known as the Kenmu Restoration. Hope stirred, but reality returned quickly. The court lacked effective administrative structures to govern a country dominated by warriors. Rewards promised to samurai were delayed or insufficient. Old aristocratic customs resurfaced, frustrating those who had fought for change. Once again, warriors felt used. Service had been demanded. Satisfaction had not followed. The pattern repeated. Ashikaga Takauji watched carefully. He had supported the emperor's cause, but he also recognized its limitations. Within just a few years, he turned against Go-Daigo and established a new military government, this time with imperial approval, but firmly in warrior hands. The Ashikaga Shogunate was born. The fall of Kamakura marked more than the end of a regime. It revealed a lesson that would echo through Japanese history. Warriors could overthrow governments with force, but ruling required balance between legitimacy and power, reward and loyalty. Ignore that balance, and collapse followed. As smoke cleared from Kamakura's ruins, grass began to grow between broken stones. The sea continued its endless motion, indifferent to human ambition. Another era had ended, another was beginning. Ashikaga rule and the world of the provincial lord. Morning returns to Kyoto beneath a pale, uncertain sky. Temple bells echo softly through narrow streets. Smoke rises from cooking fires where ruins once stood. Grass pushes between stones blackened by old flames. The capital still breathes, but it has been changed. When Ashikaga Takauji established his shogunate in 1336, he chose not to abandon Kyoto. Unlike Kamakura, which had ruled from distance and separation, the Ashikaga governed from within the old heart of Japan. Their headquarters stood in the Muromachi district, close to the imperial palace and the ceremonial life of the court. This choice was deliberate. Takauji sought legitimacy as much as control. The emperor would remain visible. The past would not be erased, but authority would belong to warriors. The Muromachi shogunate existed in tension from its beginning. Power was shared uneasily between the shogun, the emperor, and powerful military families. Unlike the Kamakura regime, which enforced obedience through clear hierarchy, the Ashikaga relied on negotiation, alliances, and compromise. This flexibility allowed culture to flourish. It also weakened central authority. Ashikaga shoguns ruled more as first among equals than as absolute commanders. They depended on provincial military governors, shugo, to enforce order beyond Kyoto. Over time, these governors expanded their power, accumulating land, followers, and independence. The provinces grew louder, the center grew quieter. A new figure began to dominate Japanese life, the provincial lord, the daimyo. For the samurai, daily life shifted increasingly away from national concerns and toward local obligations. Loyalty was no longer directed toward a distant shogunate alone, but toward the lord who provided protection, land, and security. Service became intimate again. A lord who defended his people earned devotion. A lord who failed was abandoned. Honor adapted to circumstance. Castles evolved during this period, reflecting the new realities of power. No longer simple military outposts, they became administrative centers surrounded by towns. Artisans, merchants, and farmers clustered beneath their walls, seeking protection and opportunity. The landscape changed. Stone replaced wood. Moats carved the land. Roads linked strongholds together. War and governance merged. Despite political instability, the Muromachi period produced remarkable cultural achievement. Zen Buddhism continued to influence aesthetics and daily life. Simplicity became a guiding principle. Ink paintings captured space as much as form. Tea ceremony elevated restraint into ritual. Gardens shaped silence into art. Warriors became patrons, not merely destroyers. No theater emerged during this era performed slowly and deliberately, its masked actors embodying themes of loss, memory, and impermanence. These performances resonated deeply with a warrior class shaped by uncertainty. The stage became a mirror. Lifelike performance was fleeting. Trade expanded during Ashikaga rule. Japanese merchants traveled to Ming China and Southeast Asia, exchanging swords, lacquerware, and silver for silk books and ideas. Ports grew busy. Wealth flowed unevenly. The samurai world was no longer isolated. It was connected and challenged. Yet beneath cultural refinement, authority continued to erode. Succession disputes plagued the Ashikaga family. Shoguns came and went, some ruling only briefly. Decisions were delayed or reversed. Commands conflicted. Provincial lords acted independently, and when independence spreads, conflict follows. The breaking point came in 1467. A dispute over shogunal succession escalated into what became known as the Onin War. Two powerful factions clashed in Kyoto itself, drawing warriors from across the country into a prolonged struggle. For 10 years, the capital burned. District by district, Kyoto was destroyed. Mansions collapsed. Temples were reduced to ash. Civilians fled. The city that symbolized order became a battlefield. And there was no victor. When the fighting finally ended, the Ashikaga shogunate still existed, but only in name. Its authority had dissolved. Provincial lords returned home, carrying weapons and ambition. Japan had fractured. The age of centralized rule was over. In the aftermath, provinces governed themselves. Daimyo fortified their lands, raised armies, and pursued expansion. Alliances shifted constantly. Betrayal became common. This new era would later be called the Sengoku Jidai, the age of warring states, a time without rules. For the samurai, this meant constant readiness. Peace was temporary. Trust was conditional. Families trained for war as a matter of survival. Children grew up hearing armor before poetry. Honor did not disappear, but it changed. As night settles over a rebuilt corner of Kyoto, a single lantern glows in a temple hall. Beyond the city castle, fires burn steadily across the provinces, each marking a lord's claim. The old order has faded. The world now belongs to those who can hold it. And the age of endless war is about to begin. Part 10. the age of endless war. Mist clings to the hills at dawn. From a watchtower, a guard peers into the valley below. Smoke rises from scattered villages. Somewhere a drum sounds, once, then falls silent. There is no front line anymore. All of Japan has become the battlefield. The Sengoku Jidai, the age of warring states, did not begin with a single declaration or decisive moment. It emerged gradually as central authority faded and local ambition filled the void. After the Onin War, the Ashikaga Shogunate no longer commanded obedience. Kyoto remained a symbol, but power had dispersed into the provinces. Each domain became its own world, and each world prepared for war. Daimyo ruled by strength strategy and adaptability. Their legitimacy no longer depended on imperial recognition alone, but on their ability to protect land and people. Borders shifted constantly. Alliances formed and collapsed with little warning. A trusted ally one year could become an enemy the next. Stability was temporary. Readiness was permanent. Warfare changed in scale and structure. Armies grew larger, drawing not only samurai, but increasing numbers of Ashigaru foot soldiers, often recruited from farming communities. These men fought for pay survival or obligation, forming disciplined units under samurai command. The battlefield grew crowded. Individual heroics still mattered, but coordination mattered more. Castles transformed dramatically during this era. Once modest fortifications, they became massive complexes with stone walls, layered defenses, and intricate gate systems. Built on hills or surrounded by moats, they dominated the landscape. A castle was no longer just a refuge, it was a statement of power. Life in the shadow of constant conflict was precarious. Farmers fled advancing armies, crops were seized or destroyed. Famine followed prolonged campaigns. Disease spread through crowded towns and camps, and yet life continued. Fields were replanted between wars. Markets reopened when armies moved on. Children learned to sleep through the sound of marching feet. Resilience became instinct. Samurai identity hardened under these conditions. Loyalty shifted from abstract ideals toward tangible protection. A lord who could defend his followers earned devotion. A lord who failed was abandoned. Honor adapted. Survival shaped ethics as much as tradition. Among the countless warlords of this era, a few figures stood out, men whose leadership came to define entire regions. Takeda Shingen of Kai Province became known for discipline and strategic brilliance. His cavalry moved with devastating coordination, earning a reputation that echoed across central Japan. Uesugi Kenshin of Echigo, his rival, fought with fierce conviction, guided by a sense of righteousness, shaped by Buddhist devotion. Their repeated clashes became legendary, not because they ended the chaos, but because they embodied it. War was personal again, but on a larger scale. Religion did not stand apart from conflict. Warrior monks Sohei defended temple lands with armies of their own. Fortified monasteries rivaled castles in strength. Faith and force intertwined in unsettling ways. Sacred ground became contested ground. Belief did not soften war. It joined it. Daily life for samurai families reflected constant uncertainty. Children were trained early. Armor was kept close. Marriages were arranged for alliance rather than affection. Hostages were exchanged to secure treaties, sometimes treated kindly, sometimes not. Trust was negotiated, not assumed. New influences entered Japan during this time. In the mid-16th century, European traders arrived bringing unfamiliar goods, new religions, and, most importantly, firearms. The matchlock gun, the arquebus, was initially a curiosity. Then it proved effective. Bullets pierced armor that arrows could not. Training peasants to fire guns took weeks, not years. The balance of power shifted quietly. The old ways faced a new reality, yet change did not come instantly. Tradition resisted innovation. Some daimyo embraced firearms eagerly, others hesitated, clinging to established martial ideals. The battlefield became an experiment. Those who adapted survived, those who did not faded. As decades passed, the cost of endless war became unbearable. Resources thinned, populations declined. The desire for order grew stronger among all classes, warriors, farmers, merchants alike. Chaos had reached its limit, and in that exhaustion opportunity appeared. Among the many warlords maneuvering through this turmoil, 3 figures began to rise, each shaped by the Sengoku world, each determined not merely to survive it, but to end it. One would shatter tradition, one would unify through compromise, one would build peace that endured. The age of endless war was approaching its conclusion. As night falls on a restless land, campfires flicker beneath castle walls. Generals study maps by lamplight. Somewhere a decision is made that will ripple outward for generations. The storm has lasted long enough. Change is coming. The age of endless war mist clings to the hills at dawn. From a watchtower, a guard peers into the valley below. Smoke rises from scattered villages. Somewhere a drum sounds, once then falls silent. There is no front line anymore. All of Japan has become the battlefield. The Sengoku Jidai, the age of warring states, did not begin with a single declaration or decisive moment. It emerged gradually as central authority faded and local ambition filled the void. After the Onin War, the Ashikaga Shogunate no longer commanded obedience. Kyoto remained a symbol, but power had dispersed into the provinces. Each domain became its own world, and each world prepared for war. Daimyo ruled by strength, strategy, and adaptability. Their legitimacy no longer depended on imperial recognition alone, but on their ability to protect land and people. Borders shifted constantly, alliances formed and collapsed with little warning. A trusted ally one year could become an enemy the next. Stability was temporary. Readiness was permanent. Warfare changed in scale and structure. Armies grew larger, drawing not only samurai but increasing numbers of Ashigaru foot soldiers, often recruited from farming communities. These men fought for pay, survival, or obligation, forming disciplined units under samurai command. The battlefield grew crowded. Individual heroics still mattered, but coordination mattered more. Castles transformed dramatically during this era. Once modest fortifications, they became massive complexes with stone walls, layered defenses, and intricate gate systems. Built on hills or surrounded by moats, they dominated the landscape. A castle was no longer just a refuge. It was a statement of power. Life in the shadow of constant conflict was precarious. Farmers fled advancing armies, crops were seized or destroyed, famine followed prolonged campaigns, disease spread through crowded towns and camps, and yet life continued. Fields were replanted between wars, markets reopened when armies moved on. Children learned to sleep through the sound of marching feet. Resilience became instinct. Samurai identity hardened under these conditions. Loyalty shifted from abstract ideals toward tangible protection. A lord who could defend his followers earned devotion. A lord who failed was abandoned. Honor adapted. Survival shaped ethics as much as tradition. Among the countless warlords of this era, a few figures stood out, men whose leadership came to define entire regions. Takeda Shingen of Kai Province became known for discipline and strategic brilliance. His cavalry moved with devastating coordination, earning a reputation that echoed across central Japan. Uesugi Kenshin of Ichigo, his rival, fought with fierce conviction, guided by a sense of righteousness shaped by Buddhist devotion. Their repeated clashes became legendary, not because they ended the chaos, but because they embodied it. War was personal again, but on a larger scale. Religion did not stand apart from conflict. Warrior monks Sohei defended temple lands with armies of their own. Fortified monasteries rivaled castles in strength. Faith and force intertwined in unsettling ways. Sacred ground became contested ground. Belief did not soften war, it joined it. Daily life for samurai families reflected constant uncertainty. Children were trained early. Armor was kept close. Marriages were arranged for alliance rather than affection. Hostages were exchanged to secure treaties, sometimes treated kindly, sometimes not. Trust was negotiated, not assumed. New influences entered Japan during this time. In the mid-16th century, European traders arrived bringing unfamiliar goods, new religions, and most importantly, firearms. The matchlock gun, the arquebus, was initially a curiosity. Then it proved effective. Bullets pierced armor that arrows could not. Training peasants to fire guns took weeks, not years. The balance of power shifted quietly. The old ways faced a new reality. Yet change did not come instantly. Tradition resisted innovation. Some daimyo embraced firearms eagerly, others hesitated, clinging to established martial ideals. The battlefield became an experiment. Those who adapted survived, those who did not faded. As decades passed, the cost of endless war became unbearable. Resources thinned, populations declined. The desire for order grew stronger among all classes, warriors, farmers, merchants alike. Chaos had reached its limit, and in that exhaustion, opportunity appeared. Among the many warlords maneuvering through this turmoil, three figures began to rise, each shaped by the Sengoku world, each determined not merely to survive it, but to end it. One would shatter tradition, one would unify through compromise, one would build peace that endured. The age of endless war was approaching its conclusion. As night falls on a restless land, campfires flicker beneath castle walls. Generals study maps by lamplight. Somewhere a decision is made that will ripple outward for generations. The storm has lasted long enough. Change is coming. Three men who changed everything. Rain falls softly over a war-torn land. It darkens the packed earth of roads worn smooth by marching feet. It beads on armor stacked beneath eaves. It washes blood from places where no one pauses anymore. Japan has known war for generations, and now from within that exhaustion, three men step forward, each shaped by chaos, each determined to master it. The Sengoku age did not end because the fighting simply burned itself out. It ended because certain individuals understood the nature of the storm and learned how to bend it. They saw that endless conflict could not sustain power. Control required something more deliberate. The first to act was Oda Nobunaga. Born in 1534 into a minor daimyo family in Owari province, Nobunaga did not fit the expectations of his time. As a young man, he dressed carelessly, ignored ceremony, and behaved unpredictably. Many dismissed him as reckless, even foolish. They underestimated him. Beneath the disorder was clarity. Nobunaga understood that tradition alone would not win wars anymore. The Sengoku battlefield had changed. Armies were larger, supply mattered, discipline mattered. Innovation mattered most of all. When Portuguese traders introduced firearms to Japan in the 1540s, many samurai saw them as inelegant, noisy tools, unworthy of a warrior's spirit. Nobunaga saw efficiency. At the Battle of Nagashino in 1575, Nobunaga demonstrated this vision decisively. His forces used massed volleys of arquebus fire coordinated behind wooden palisades to destroy the famed Takeda cavalry. It was not heroic combat. It was devastatingly effective. The old romantic battlefield died there. Nobunaga also confronted institutions that limited his authority. Powerful Buddhist monasteries, long protected by tradition and armed by warrior monks, stood as independent forces. To Nobunaga, they were obstacles. His destruction of the Enryakuji monastery complex on Mount Hiei shocked contemporaries and horrifies later generations. It was ruthless, it was deliberate, and it sent a message. No power stood beyond his reach. Yet Nobunaga ruled through fear as much as strategy. He broke resistance quickly, but he did not always build stable alliances. In 1582, he was betrayed by one of his own generals, Akechi Mitsuhide, and forced to take his own life in Kyoto. His ambition died with him, but the path he cleared did not. That path was taken up by Toyotomi Hideyoshi. Hideyoshi's origins were humble, so humble that they bordered on scandal. Born to a peasant family, he rose through Nobunaga's ranks through loyalty, intelligence, and adaptability. He understood people as well as battlefields. Where Nobunaga crushed Hideyoshi, absorbed. Hideyoshi moved swiftly to avenge his former lord, defeating Akechi Mitsuhide within days. From there he continued the unification of Japan, but with a different style. He offered surrender rather than annihilation. He rewarded loyalty generously. He bound former enemies through marriage and obligation. Unity followed not instantly, but steadily. One of Hideyoshi's most enduring reforms was the separation of classes. Peasants were disarmed. Samurai were fixed as a distinct social group. Mobility decreased, but rebellion became less likely. Order replaced chaos. But order required vigilance. Hideyoshi's rule was not without contradiction. Having risen from nothing, he feared instability deeply. This fear drove him toward grand gestures, most notably the invasions of Korea in the 1590s. These campaigns drained Japan's resources and cost countless lives. Though initially successful, they ultimately failed to achieve lasting goals. When Hideyoshi died in 1598, the unity he created rested on fragile agreements. The future was uncertain once again. Into this uncertainty stepped Tokugawa Ieyasu. Patient, cautious, and observant, Ieyasu had survived decades of shifting alliances by choosing his moments carefully. He learned from Nobunaga's boldness and Hideyoshi's ambition, but avoided their excesses. He waited. The decisive moment came in 1600 at the Battle of Sekigahara. Fog hung over the valley as opposing armies gathered. Tens of thousands of men stood ready, their loyalty uncertain. The outcome hinged not on force alone, but on timing and defection. When key commanders switched sides mid-battle, the balance tipped irrevocably. By day's end, Ieyasu stood victorious. 3 years later, he was appointed shogun. But unlike his predecessors, Tokugawa Ieyasu did not rule through conquest alone. He ruled through systems carefully designed to prevent the return of chaos. He learned the final lesson of the Sengoku age. Peace must be enforced as carefully as war. As rain fades and clouds lift over a newly unified land, banners are lowered. Armies disband. Roads once crowded with soldiers begin to carry merchants instead. The age of endless war has ended. But for the samurai, a new challenge now emerges. Who are warriors in a world that no longer needs them to fight? Peace under watchful eyes. Morning arrives quietly in Edo. Mist drifts along the wide moat that surrounds the shogun's castle. Water birds skim the surface, leaving brief ripples behind them. From distant streets comes the soft sound of wooden sandals on packed earth. There is no alarm, no call to arms, only order. When Tokugawa Ieyasu established his shogunate in 1603, he did so with the memory of chaos still fresh. He had seen alliances shatter, cities burn, and loyalty dissolve under pressure. His ambition was not glory, it was permanence. Japan, he believed, must never again descend into endless war. Edo, chosen as the seat of power, reflected this vision. Unlike Kyoto, it carried little symbolic weight from the past. Unlike Kamakura, it was not a reminder of warrior rebellion. Edo was new, expandable, and strategically positioned. From here, authority could be shaped deliberately. The Tokugawa did not merely rule Japan, they managed it. The structure of power under the Tokugawa shogunate was layered and careful. The emperor remained in Kyoto revered as a sacred figure removed from day-to-day governance. The shogun ruled in practice, issuing laws, controlling land distribution, and commanding military loyalty. This separation preserved tradition while neutralizing it. Legitimacy and authority were no longer the same thing. To prevent rebellion, the Tokugawa imposed a system of control, both subtle and relentless. Daimyo were allowed to retain their domains, but under strict conditions. Castles were regulated. Marriages required approval. Alliances were monitored. Most famously, the system of Sankin Kotai, alternate attendance, was enforced. Every daimyo was required to spend alternating years in Edo while their families remained there permanently. Travel was expensive. Residences were costly. Rebellion became financially impossible. For the samurai, these policies reshaped daily life. Warriors no longer lived primarily on rural estates. They moved into castle towns, forming dense communities organized by rank and duty. Instead of preparing for battle, most served as administrators, guards, clerks, and officials. They still carried swords, but those swords rarely left their scabbards. The samurai's income now came in the form of stipends, usually paid in rice. These stipends were fixed, reflecting status rather than labor. At first, this system provided stability. Over time, it became a source of strain. Prices fluctuated, costs rose, stipends did not. Many samurai found themselves quietly impoverished. Education became central to samurai identity. Confucian philosophy was emphasized, teaching loyalty, self-control, and moral responsibility. Literacy was expected. Writing, accounting, and legal reasoning replaced battlefield skill. The ideal warrior was no longer fierce. He was composed. Law under the Tokugawa was strict but predictable. Duels were forbidden. Unauthorized violence was punished harshly. Carrying weapons was regulated. Public order was enforced through clear hierarchy and ritual. Violence did not disappear, but it was controlled, contained, and rare. Urban culture flourished in this atmosphere of peace. Edo grew rapidly, becoming one of the largest cities in the world. Merchants and artisans thrived. Markets expanded. Entertainment districts emerged. Kabuki theater dazzled audiences. Woodblock prints captured fleeting beauty. Popular fiction spread widely. Samurai observed this world with mixed feelings. They were respected, but often poorer than those they outranked. This contradiction gnawed quietly at the warrior class. Officially, samurai stood above merchants. In practice, many borrowed money from them. Pride endured, but it bent under reality. Some adapted by taking secondary roles, teaching clerical work or scholarship. Others retreated into frugality, clinging to discipline as dignity. Identity became internal rather than visible. Religion continued to shape behavior. Zen practice endured, reinforcing restraint and acceptance. Neo-Confucianism gained influence, framing social order as natural and moral. The samurai were taught that their role was not to fight, but to uphold stability. Peace itself became their duty. Foreign contact was tightly controlled. Trade continued through limited channels, but outside influence was filtered carefully. This policy, often called sakoku, turned Japan inward. The world beyond the sea existed, but at a distance. For generations, this distance felt safe. As decades passed, peace hardened into habit. Children grew up without seeing war. Armor gathered dust. Techniques once vital became ceremonial, yet memory did not vanish. Stories of past battles were told and retold. Lineages were preserved. The image of the warrior lived on even as its function changed. As evening settles over Edo, lanterns glow along canals. A samurai walks home through quiet streets, swords at his side untouched. He has not fought a battle, but he guards an order built on centuries of blood. And he knows, perhaps without words, that peace is not the absence of force. The sword without a battlefield. Evening settles softly over the castle town. Paper lanterns sway in the breeze, casting warm pools of light onto packed earth streets. Shopkeepers slide wooden shutters closed. Somewhere, a flute plays a slow, wandering melody that seems to linger in the air after the sound fades. A samurai pauses at a crossroads. His swords hang at his side, polished and carefully maintained. They have not been drawn in years. By the middle of the Edo period, Japan had known peace for generations. The Tokugawa system held firm its layers of control and ritual, working exactly as intended. Rebellion was rare. Violence was contained. Life followed predictable rhythms. For the nation, this stability was a triumph. For the samurai, it was a quiet trial. The warrior class still existed, still commanded respect, still stood at the top of the social hierarchy. Yet the conditions that had given birth to the samurai constant danger-shifting loyalties, the need for decisive violence, had largely disappeared. The battlefield had vanished, and with it, certainty. The sword remained the most visible symbol of samurai identity. Laws permitted only samurai to wear paired blades in public, marking them unmistakably. The daisho longsword and short was not merely a weapon set, it was a declaration. I belong to this class. I carry this history. But symbols demand interpretation. As years passed without war, samurai thinkers began to ask difficult questions. What did honor mean in a world where bravery was never tested? What did loyalty require when service meant paperwork and patrols rather than combat? These questions did not produce a single answer. They produced reflection. During this era, writings on warrior ethics multiplied. Philosophers, former samurai, and scholars attempted to articulate what the samurai should be when he was no longer needed as a fighter. From these efforts emerged what later generations would call Bushido, the way of the warrior. But this was not an ancient unified code. It was a response to peace. Some writers emphasized absolute loyalty to one's lord, even unto death. Others stressed moral cultivation, self-control, sincerity, and righteousness. Still others focused on readiness, the idea that a warrior must live as though death could arrive at any moment, even in times of calm. The sword, they argued, must remain ready, even if it was never used. These ideals were often stricter than historical reality. The samurai of earlier centuries had negotiated, defected, adapted. They had survived by compromise as often as by sacrifice. Now the past was being refined, memory smoothed into ideal. Daily life for many samurai was marked by quiet frustration. Stipends paid in rice lost value as the economy evolved. Merchants grew wealthier, while warriors struggled to maintain appearances. Debts accumulated. Pride endured. Resentment simmered silently. The old hierarchy remained intact, but reality pressed against it. Some samurai adapted creatively. They became teachers, scholars, or administrators. Education expanded, and many samurai families prided themselves on literacy and moral instruction. Others turned to art, calligraphy, poetry, painting as a way to preserve refinement and purpose. The brush gained prominence alongside the blade. Martial training did not disappear, but it changed character. Sword schools flourished, each emphasizing different philosophies, speed timing, restraint awareness. Training focused on form rather than killing, on control rather than conquest. Sparring became ritualized, technique became theory, combat became internal. In this environment, the idea of dying well gained prominence. Some texts suggested that a samurai should always be prepared to die instantly if honor demanded it. This emphasis reflected anxiety as much as conviction. If one could not prove worth through action, one could prove it through resolve, even if that resolve was never tested. Legends of earlier warriors were collected and retold, often embellished. Figures from the Genpei War or the Sengoku period were recast as moral exemplars rather than historical individuals. Complexity faded, certainty replaced doubt. The past became a guidebook rather than a record. Yet many samurai felt the gap between ideal and reality keenly. Living under the weight of perfection was exhausting. To fall short of an imagined standard, even one invented centuries later, invited quiet shame. Honor became internalized pressure. Beyond the samurai class, Japan continued to change. Cities expanded. Markets grew more complex. Information circulated faster. New ideas filtered in through controlled foreign contact. The world was moving. The samurai stood still. Some resisted change, fiercely clinging to tradition as identity. Others sensed that the Tokugawa order, for all its stability, was becoming brittle, unable to adapt to pressures building beyond its borders. They felt history stirring again. As night deepens, a samurai sits alone in a small room. A lamp flickers. He studies a text, not a manual of tactics, but a moral treatise on duty and conduct. His swords rest nearby. He wonders, perhaps without words, whether they define him or whether he must define himself anew. The answer will not come gently. Change is approaching from beyond the sea, carrying ideas and forces the Tokugawa system was never designed to contain. The sword without a battlefield will soon face a world that demands a choice. The end of the samurai world. The sea is unnaturally still. Then, from the horizon, dark shapes emerge: tall masts, black hulls, columns of smoke rising where no smoke should rise. The water trembles beneath unfamiliar engines. Along the shoreline, fishermen stop mid-motion, nets hanging forgotten in their hands. Japan is no longer alone. For more than 2 centuries, the Tokugawa Shogunate had preserved peace through control, ritual, and isolation. Foreign contact was limited, carefully managed, and distant. The outside world existed, but it felt abstract, filtered through trade at Nagasaki, rumors carried by books and whispers. That distance vanished in 1853. When American warships under Commodore Matthew Perry sailed into Edo Bay, They did not come as visitors seeking permission. They arrived with steam-powered vessels and cannons capable of destroying wooden defenses with ease. Their message was unmistakable: open or be opened by force. The shock rippled through every level of Japanese society. Samurai who had trained for sword combat stared at weapons that made armor meaningless. Officials accustomed to ceremony faced demands backed by industrial power. The shogunate hesitated, then conceded. Treaties were signed. Ports were opened. Unequal agreements granted foreign nations privileges Japan could not refuse. For many samurai, this was humiliation. The government they served had failed its most basic duty to protect the country from domination. Confidence in the Tokugawa order began to erode. Some argued that the shogunate had grown weak through peace. Others believed isolation itself had left Japan vulnerable. Still others turned their frustration toward the emperor, seeing him as a symbol of unity lost. A powerful slogan spread among disaffected samurai: "Sono Joy," revere the emperor, expel the barbarians. It was both a political demand and an emotional cry. Violence returned not in great battles, but in targeted acts. Assassinations of foreign officials and shogunate supporters occurred. Domains split along ideological lines. Young samurai raised on ideals of loyalty and sacrifice found purpose in radical action. Order began to fracture. Once again, Japan stood at a crossroads. The Tokugawa shogunate attempted reform, modernizing military forces and adopting Western technology. But reform from above came too slowly, and trust had already been lost. In the domains of Satsuma and Choshu, powerful leaders began to organize resistance not to modernization, but to Tokugawa rule itself. Ironically, these domains adopted Western weapons while claiming to defend tradition. History twisted in on itself. In 1868, the long-standing political order collapsed. The shogunate fell. Power was returned, at least symbolically, to the emperor. The Meiji Restoration began. But this was no simple return to the past. It was a leap into the future. The new government moved swiftly. Feudal domains were abolished. Samurai stipends were ended or converted into bonds. Class distinctions were dismantled. A national conscript army replaced hereditary warriors. The sword, once the mark of identity, was banned from public wear. Centuries of privilege vanished in a single generation. For many, samurai adaptation was painful, but possible. Their education, discipline, and literacy allowed them to become bureaucrats, teachers, military officers, and industrial leaders. They reshaped themselves, but others could not. To some, the loss of the sword was the loss of self. The warrior class had not merely been an occupation, it had been a way of life, a moral framework, an inheritance carried in blood and memory. Resistance flared. The most famous of these uprisings was the Satsuma Rebellion of 1877, led by Saigo Takamori, a man often remembered as the last samurai. Once a supporter of imperial restoration, Saigo turned against the new government when he saw traditional values swept aside. His followers were former samurai proud and desperate. They faced a modern conscript army armed with rifles and artillery. The outcome was inevitable. In the final battles, swords met guns. Courage met industrial firepower. Saigo's forces were overwhelmed. Saigo himself died, whether by battlefield wound or ritual suicide, remains debated. With his death organized, samurai resistance ended. The samurai had lost not because they lacked bravery, but because the world they were built for no longer existed. Japan moved forward rapidly. Railways spread across the land. Factories rose. Education expanded. The nation transformed itself into a modern state in astonishingly little time. And the warrior class faded into history. Yet endings are rarely clean. Families preserved swords as heirlooms. Stories were told quietly at home. Shrines remembered names no longer spoken publicly. The samurai disappeared from law but not from memory. They became something else. As twilight falls on a modernizing Japan, an old blade is wrapped carefully in cloth and placed away. It will never be carried again. It will never decide a battle. But it will not be forgotten. Steel does not forget the hands that shaped it. The samurai world has ended. But what remains, discipline, loyalty, reflection, will not vanish so easily. Steel echoes. The samurai legacy night settles gently over modern Japan. Neon light hums in distant streets. A train passes with a soft, measured rhythm. In a quiet room far from the noise, a sword rests inside its scabbard, wrapped carefully in cloth. The age of the samurai is over, but it has not disappeared. When the Meiji Restoration dismantled the old order, the samurai vanished as a class almost overnight. Titles were erased, privileges revoked. The sword, once worn openly as proof of identity, was confined to memory and ceremony. Yet something remained, not the armor, not the battlefield, but the habits of mind shaped by centuries of service. Former samurai helped build modern Japan. They staffed ministries, organized schools, and commanded the new national army. Their literacy, discipline, and sense of duty proved adaptable to a rapidly changing world. What had once been loyalty to a lord became loyalty to institutions. Service changed its object, but not its meaning. Over time, however, the image of the samurai began to drift away from history and toward myth. Writers, educators, and political leaders reshaped the past, selecting certain values while smoothing away contradictions. Bushido, once a loose collection of ideas shaped by circumstance, was presented as an ancient, unified moral code. Honor became absolute. Loyalty became unquestioned. Doubt faded from the story. The samurai became ideal, and ideals are powerful. In the early 20th century, this idealized image was used to inspire unity and sacrifice. Samurai language entered schools' military doctrine and national rhetoric. The warrior spirit was invoked not as history, but as destiny. The past was no longer remembered. It was mobilized. After the devastation of World War II, Japan confronted the consequences of that transformation. Militarism was rejected. The nation turned toward peace reconstruction and reflection. Once again, the samurai legacy shifted. This time it softened. Martial traditions survived, but their purpose changed. Swordsmanship became kendo, a practice of discipline and character, rather than killing. Archery transformed into kyudo, emphasizing breath posture and presence. The act remained. The intention evolved. Combat gave way to cultivation. Craftsmanship carried the legacy forward in quieter ways. Swordsmiths continued their work not to supply armies, but to preserve tradition. Their blades became works of art, expressions of patience and precision. A single sword could take months to forge, steel folded, hammer struck, time respected. In this process, the samurai lived on not as a fighter, but as a standard of care. The influence extended into daily life. Concepts shaped by samurai culture, dedication, endurance, responsibility found new expression in business, education, and craft. Sometimes these values were praised. Sometimes they were questioned. Long hours, loyalty to organizations, quiet perseverance. The legacy was not always gentle. Popular culture, too, carried the samurai forward. Films, novels, and later games and animation reimagined the warrior as a tragic figure caught between duty and change, honor and survival. These stories resonated across borders because they spoke to universal questions. What do we owe the past? How do we live when the world no longer needs what we were taught to be? The samurai became a mirror. Historians, meanwhile, worked to recover complexity. They reminded us that real samurai negotiated, compromised, feared, and adapted. That loyalty was often conditional, that ideals evolved over time. The truth, as always, was more human than legend, and more interesting. In modern Japan, the samurai are present everywhere and nowhere. Their armor rests in museums, their names appear on street signs and family records. Their swords are displayed behind glass. They are remembered. But they no longer rule. Perhaps the most enduring legacy lies not in objects or stories, but in rhythm. The rhythm of preparation, the rhythm of restraint, the rhythm of acting only when necessary. These are lessons shaped by centuries of uncertainty, and they still matter. Imagine now a final image, a narrow road at dusk, cicadas singing in tall grass, mountains dark against a fading sky. No banners fly, no armor moves, only wind and earth remain. Somewhere beneath that soil steel once rested. Above it, life continues unaware, unburdened. The samurai do not return. They do not need to. Their story has already entered the quiet current of time, no longer commanding, no longer resisting, but enduring as memory, reflection, and question. A legacy not of violence but of transformation.